slides loaded up here. Thank you for coming and joining us today for our 26th session of the Journey Down the Clackamas. I'm Garth Wyatt. I'm a senior scientist with Portland General Electric, just outside of Estacada on the Clackamas River. Joining me this afternoon is Tim Shibahara, who's a CRBC board member, and he's going to assist me with all the technical aspects of the presentations. Before we get into our program, I'm going to cover a few items. Since its founding 26 years ago, the Clackamas River Basin Council has worked as a non-governmental group of stakeholders to protect and improve the Clackamas River Basin and its tributaries. Their mission is to foster partnerships for clean water and improve fish and wildlife habitat and the quality of life for all those who live, work, and recreate within the Clackamas River watershed. On behalf of the Clackamas River Council, I'd like to thank our two gold sponsors, Oregon Beverage Recycling Cooperative and the Clackamas Water Environment Services. We also thank our bronze sponsors, Clackamas River Water Providers, the Geological Society of Oregon Country, Fort Blakely, and Metro. And there's also, I've got to give thanks to the many individuals who have donated to support this conference. We seek to add additional donations, which are tax deductible. The Clackamas River Basin has been occupied by Native peoples for millennia. It was originally the territory of the Clackamas, Chinook, Molalla, Kalapuya, and other peoples, and is currently recognized as lands of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, the Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs, and belongs to other Native peoples who may not be federally recognized. We thank those who came before us in stewardship of these lands and waters, and who continue to steward them now and into the future. We are gathered for this journey down the Clackamas to learn in-depth information about the basin and its connections to Oregon as a whole, and to connect with each other so we can support our mutual efforts to protect and improve the Clackamas River and its tributaries, and to have some educational fun. CRBC is partnering with the Environmental Learning Center at Clackamas Community College. Workshop attendees will receive a signed certificate of completion for each session. If you would like a certificate of completion, add your contact information to our Journey Down the Clackamas Conference networking Google Sheet, which should be attached in the chat, and indicate that you'd like a certificate in the G column. We'll forward your contact information to the Clackamas Community College. So I'd like to share a few ground rules before I introduce our special guests. Please keep your microphone on mute unless you're invited to participate, and you can keep your cameras off if you like. This will help us save bandwidth for our presenters and greatly reduce the carbon footprint of our meeting. We'll have two presenters this afternoon. Please type your questions in the chat and we will select questions from there. However, if your question is long and or complex, please feel free to ask it in audio following each speaker's presentation. Now, I'll add, after talking with both speakers, if there's a burning question on your mind and it's relevant to the slide at hand, you can raise your hand. You can use that function in the toolbar in the reactions menu, and we'll stop and you can ask that question, as these are going to be really, I think, two unique presentations. If you've got a question that you absolutely need answered within the presentation, both presenters have agreed to address that. So we'll start our presentation this afternoon. Remember to type your questions in the chat, keep yourself muted, and we'll answer questions at the end of the presentation, with the exceptions if you do have one that you really need to get answered and it's a technical aspect that would be best suited to answer during the presentation. Utilize that reaction button on the bottom of your screen. The webinar is going to extend until about 3:45. And with that, I'd like to provide a bio of our presenters. Our first presenter is Brian Bair. For the last 15 years, Brian has worked as a USDA Enterprise Program as a watershed restoration projects lead. Brian's life goal is to leave the earth better than he found it, and has devoted his career to watershed and aquatic habitat restoration. Brian has worked throughout the United States, from Alaska to Florida, Maine to Hawaii, on large-scale restoration projects. Brian received a BS in biology from Montana State University in 1990, and then migrated to the Columbia River Gorge to windsurf and work in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, where he developed a series of partnerships and began large-scale aquatic habitat restoration on the Wind River Ranger District. Brian's work on the Wind River was recognized nationally and was assigned as a team, and he was assigned as a team lead for the R6 Pacific Northwest Regional Restoration Team which provided stream restoration and fish passage design and implementation assistance to national forests and districts in Oregon and Washington. Brian also worked with an international program to assist the Ministry of Environment, British Columbia, Canada, with restoration projects in Williams Lake, BC, and the Queen Charlotte Islands. When Brian is not working on rivers, he's usually playing on them. Brian is also now a grandpa and loves spending time with his family, dogs, and camping with a significant other, Tina. So with that, I think we'll move into Brian's presentation. And I'm Geoff, I'll give you your bio when we move into yours.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for inviting me. And God, that was a long-winded bio. I should have probably kept it. Anyway, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you. And seriously, if you have any questions as I'm going through, just unmute and pipe up. So with that, we will start out. So is this loaded up, Garth?
Yeah, it's moving that direction. It says it started screen sharing. Just give it a second here.
Okay. Yeah, and interrupt me if the slides are not catching up. Some of them I'm going to go through fairly fast.
Yeah, it took a few seconds for it to load last time. There we go.
All right.
You're up.
So my presentation is going to be on restoring large wood, and really the focus of it is restoring floodplains and really kind of where the state of the science is. I want to look at the history of disturbance, the kind of war against rivers, floodplains, and wood. And then also a brief look at the history of fish habitat enhancement and some of the first early reintroduction of large woody debris efforts. And talk about how real science started showing up in the 90s. And then really the paradigm shifts of natural stream corridor design and where most of us are now. Everybody lives in the Pacific Northwest knows, logging in the early part of the years were really the first, impact on aquatic habitat. However, I think a lot of people don't really understand a lot of times the scope and the scale of which the logging occurred. And also that the early foresters were doing it on a watershed basis. So their rotations were taking watershed by watershed. This is a picture of the Upper Wind River watershed. Actually stumbled across this in the Archie files, and it was classified by the Department of War or unclassified. But anyway, they would start in the stream corridor and basically work up toward the ridge tops. And then the mode that they used most were splash damming. Now, the splash dams in the Northwest were really way more sophisticated than they were like in Montana and some of the other places, just because of the volume of wood we had. And this is again a picture of a log drive on the Wind River. And what they would do is basically, dam up all the major tributaries. And then once they had the reservoirs full of logs, they would release those all at once on a time thing. And actually, even before they splash dam, one of probably the primary big impacts to the channel is they went through and blasted not only the log jams, but rock outcrops, any of that other stuff, to try to make the river as much of a flume as they could so the trees wouldn't get hung up. One thing that's really interesting on this picture, if you look over here on the right-hand side of the screen, this is actually a human, a guy on belay. And I guess his job was to belay down and get any of these logs that might hook up. That was pre-OSHA, I assume. Apparently the splash dams were an awesome place to fish as well. This picture is pretty cool in a number of different things. These are all Wind River summer steelhead. And I got a quick question for you. So there's 4 fish. There's 5 fisher people. Who do you think didn't catch the fish? I'm kind of betting it's her. And then The other funny thing is I'm kind of thinking this guy is somehow related to her. Anyway, cool picture. That was taken in 1913, I think. The other thing that I think a lot of folks don't realize is how massive some of these log drives were, and that it just wasn't the Pacific Northwest. This bottom picture down here, I think, was out of Wisconsin. The kind of shifting from the early logging and disturbance. One of the other big things out here in the Pacific Northwest that had a major impact on aquatic habitat, rivers, and fish. Now, floods in general are really good for rivers and fish. I mean, they bring nutrients, wood, organics, and create side channels, wetlands, that type of thing. However, for the people living in the floodplain, it's not so awesome. The 64 floods are really fascinating in that they were a series of floods. There are actually three Pineapple Express storms that occurred from December 18th through January 7th. And I've stumbled on this picture that I thought you guys would be interested in. This is behind the North Fork Dam. And one of the little quotes on it was, there was estimated to be 100 acres of logs. Well, these are a bunch of trees, but anyway, pretty massive. And of course, you know, it created all sorts of log jams and everything else, which people deemed as being evil. And so here come the bulldozers. I think the other thing that a lot of people that live and work in here don't really realize the extent that these rivers all over Washington and Oregon have been heavily handed dealt with. This is again in Still Creek during the process of the stream cleanout after the flood. The other thing the bulldozers were used for, and it just wasn't for getting the wood out of there, but they actually pushed up hundreds and hundreds of miles of push-up levees all over the place. Good example is the Sandy River. The Sandy River, I forgot how many miles of levees are on there. The Zigzag River, even Still Creek, some of these smaller tributaries were straightened and levied. This is a picture of Still Creek after it was cleaned out. This gentleman is probably sitting there pretty proud of himself, and this is a push-up levee. And they also included riprap on here as well. And I stumbled across this this quote: "Cleaning with a bulldozer has also shown favorable results in some other Washington streams." That came out of this book, this manual of sorts. So rehabilitating and enhancing stream habitat. And it was done by the Forest Service out of the Pacific Northwest Experiment Station in 1982. That also has some sections in it talking about barrier removal. Debris and log jams pose a major threat to migration in Madras salmonids. Now, granted, some of these were barriers, but the vast majority of them were not. And this is one of those things where, you know, the early fish biologists in the summer or, you know, spring or whenever would come up to a log jam and see, you know, 10, 15 steelhead under this jam and thinking, oh my God, they can't get up. And it's like, no, they're trying to hide from, you know, bears and otters and fishermen. And first pressure that hits, it's usually typically not a problem. But what was really devastating is the amount of debris removal, you know, that occurred. And this really kind of jumped out at me here. This is talking about California. And this statement right here, it says, on nearly every major coastal river system that supported anadromous fish from the Oregon border south to Santa Cruz were taken out. And this slide is just one of the, it's on the 10 Mile River. This is California, you know, Fish and Game. They're very proud of this, but they removed on this poor South Fork, like about 350 log jams on over 35 miles of river. And so again, throughout the Pacific Northwest, most of these rivers had, these were targets, so accomplishments, widgets, basically removing the log jams. They didn't use some of the, as it kind of evolved, they kind of stopped using a lot of heavy equipment and bulldozers. And I think people were kind of like, hey, there's a little much. And so they started doing this stuff called debris notching. And this is on the Gifford Pinch Show. This is one of the first fish biologists in Region 6. These gentlemen here are a local fly fishing club. So volunteers coming out and they're notching this jam. And this picture was again Polaroid found in the same file, and says, I think it had like debris notched or jam notched. And they're all sitting there kind of patting themselves on the back and probably drinking a beer and thinking, wow, this is a good thing we just did. But yet 10 years later, that area, here's where the jam was, the stream down cut, well over 6 feet. So it dropped out of its floodplain, went from this wonderful, awesome spawning gravel to now cobble small boulder. So basically went from something like this to something like this. So here's our old stream bed to now our new stream bed. So actually 10 years after that other document was put out in 1992, people, our scientists and fish heads, started saying, actually wood's not that bad of a deal. And matter of fact, it makes pools and holds in spawning gravel, etc. So we started building all these V-weirs and K-dams and things like that. However, the vast majority of those failed because a lot of times they were building them in a system that was actively head cutting. So it would either undercut the structure or go around it and that. So then, really we're back up here, when the log jams were the stable. And this is just kind of the model of by Schultz and Shum of, first you pull the log jam out, then it down cuts, then it widens, then it starts stabilizing. And then you have stage 5 and everything's happy again. However, in my early part of the career, I tried to work a lot within stage 5. So basically there was the soil bioengineering, a much lighter touch. You had a spider here, which was, supposedly kind and gentle on the streams. And kind of interesting thing about this picture is this is where one of the old log jams was. And then you brought in crews and you put in willow stakes and willow fascines and all this other stuff. And then, well, it didn't work out that well. So then this guy showed up in the early 90s. His name was Dave Rosgen. And Dave was actually a Forest Service hydrologist on the Madison Ranger District in Montana. And when he retired, he started bringing science to river restoration and really kind of put river restoration. He was one of the first people to really actually look at hydraulics and hydrology. And Dave developed quite a cult following. And there was a lot of people that came out, like the Rosganishis and then also the Rosginians, who, there was a bunch of J-hooks and bankful benches all over the country now. But there are a lot of people that were really not that stoked on his methods, not so much his classification system, but really some of his restoration methods. And I guess I'm pretty neutral on Dave. I mean, the biggest thing for me is that he actually brought science and really kind of catapulted me into really figuring out how to work with rivers instead of trying to fight them. So there are 3 of the most accepted design approaches are survey, model, reference checks, and then design. And this is kind of the hydraulic engineer method, kind of the Army Corps of Engineers typically move in this direction. And then kind of the Rosgen approach is the natural channel design is kind of the survey develop reference templates, model it, and then build your design off of that. And then the third one, which I'm kind of in, is more of the, it's very similar. You survey, develop reference restoration templates, and also biogeomorphology templates, which I'll talk a little bit. Design, model, and then tweak if necessary. So biogeomorphology is really a real word, and it just simply means that, you know, how did the aquatic critters adapt and evolve to each of the watershed's unique geology and geography. Basically, the Coho and the Clackamas are not the same as the Coho and Resurrection Creek on the Kenai Peninsula. They all have different, you know, spawning times and water temperature preferences and everything else. They have a lot of the same habits. I mean, their juveniles love beaver ponds and that type of thing. But anyway, it's just simply looking like, you know, you have your species of fish. This is the Sandy River. And then you have your various life stages. And just take a simple example is, you know, the majority of the critters are coming in outside of the peak flow window and then outside of the turbidity windows, that type of thing. The good news for the Clackamas, you have some of the best fish heads, and not sucking up to any of you all here on the panel, but some of the best fish heads in the country. And so the Clackamas has kind of got this dialed in. So back to the restoration approach. And, you know, if you have, when you start trying to develop your reference templates, if you've got a relic reach, which means it's basically undisturbed area upstream of where you're working. In Alaska, there's quite, these are, you know, you can find quite a few of these. Here in the lower 48, they're pretty tough to find at times and impossible in others, which leaves you with more of disturbed reference sites. Now, disturbed reference sites are areas that have intact floodplains, are recovering at about the rate you would expect them to, typically high fish productivity, you know, et cetera. But the bottom line is you focus in on whatever your objectives are, and you measure the components, what you're trying to figure out and look at. You run it through a series of channel geometry equations to see if things are making sense and if what you've measured really does look like a reference. And then now we have the wonderful advantage of having HEC 2D, and you model it. So basically, you're taking your reference area and trying to develop the data to whatever you're going to end up doing in your project reach. So your templates typically look like something like this. You have a range of values. Typically for our projects, we at least develop 4 for gravel bed system, pool head, pool max, pool tail, and of course riffle. And they also come with a range of slopes that you're going to have within each of these features. And so you're taking what it was, kind of what it's become, and then what it can be again. However, the evolution of where we're at now is that, you know, a lot of us are done with working in a ditch. We're done with dealing with stage 5. Instead, we're kind of going for stage yo. So right now there's 5 most current and effective methods of floodplain rehabilitation and restoration are aggradation now. Basically, let's say you had a area that was ditched so a farmer could graze or farm an area, but there's still some remaining remnant channels or something. And so these are pretty easy. I mean, basically you plug in the ditch or fill the ditch and let it go, and maybe add some wood and some veg, and you're in good shape. And then there's the bring it up and take it down approach, which is meaning you, in sections of it, you're going to grade the main stem river, and then you're going to remove levees or sections of the levees, and then reintroduce water in the side channels. A lot of these types of projects are in areas where if you have FEMA floodways and no net rise concerns, or actually if they're big rivers and cost, a lot of times these are done. And then the squeeze it back up, basically to modify the cross-sectional area to recover its floodplain. These are done on a lot of bigger rivers where you're not really going to be going cross-channel or bringing up the main stem river. Then there is redo, start over. This is total stream corridor floodplain reconstruction. This is usually if it's been mined or some other really horrific event has happened. And then last but not least is the stage 0, fill it in and let it buck. So I'll give you some examples of those. Oh, and before I go on to that, it's really important to say that the level of restoration effort typically has to equal or exceed the disturbance that degraded the system. So in other words, basically it's going to take the same amount of diesel and horsepower or more to fix a lot of these situations as it was that created it. So the aggradation now, I'm going to use Still Creek as an example of this. And so Still Creek, like in some of those photos I showed you, were bulldozed, and in sections of it, it was straightened like right up against the valley wall. And a lot of the old floodplain and channels and side channels were left, you know, high and dry. And in those situations, the approach that we took was basically kind of plugging it with a series of log jams. And so these are what we call emulated landslide deposits, ELDs. So basically coming off of the valley wall and making plugs. So you usually have to do these in series. Like there's one here, you can kind of see one on downstream, because otherwise, as you grade and it comes up, it'll just come circle back into the old ditch. These are pretty massive structures. A lot of guys, Greg Warner and those folks actually got it to where we could pull over mature trees and use those as kind of key members for these structures. Anyway, here's a ELD here, and this is after we plugged all the other ones and turned the water loose, basically. These are kind of fun because usually there's a lot of stands of mature or even old growth vegetation in them. Again, they're pretty massive structures. Pay attention to Greg's head on here. So his head would have been kind of under here, but the end result is wetlands, basically. Oh, and kind of one of the things on this, we used LiDAR pretty heavily to figure out where these old side channels were and things like that. But there was some kind of unexpected and pretty cool things that happened too. You know, after we turned the water on a lot of these, of course, we're like little kids following, seeing where it goes. And this ended up pouring into this old alcove that was built by Geoff Hales like in the 90s. And it was just so beautiful and such a beautiful accident, but we still took credit for it, of course. So anyway, this is just a look at one project area on Still Creek on the Mount Hood, where we built these different jams in these various sections of the floodplain that were reactivated. And I need to say that the degraded channel in here ranged from about 3 to 6 feet. So they were pretty significant. Okay, so bring it up and take them down. So this is, I showed you that picture of where those guys were cutting out the log jam. Well, this is the channel. This is Trout Creek. It's a tributary of the Wind River over in Washington State. And this was one of my first big floodplain restoration projects. And what we ended up doing, it was kind of funny when I proposed this, because there was over a mile of old growth habitat in here that this was going to rewater, but you would have thought I was like Putin or something. But man, I got the national stream team called on me and everything else, and people were hair on fire. Well, anyway, the stream team agreed. They're like, yeah, you can do it. You just need to figure out the sediment thing. And so the compromise was to build, again, a series of jams in this old channel. And then we ended up degrading, like cutting about 300 feet of the old channel down a couple of feet. and pulled water in. This was done, I think, in '95, and it's still active today. It's one of the most beautiful channels I've been able to put water on, honestly. We finished a similar project on Red Hill, or the Red Hill project. It's on the West Fork Hood River. We just finished this last year. Each of these yellow areas is a constructed riffle kind of log jam emulated landslide debris thing. And the West Fork was brutalized. And we think most of the impacts were coming from the early splash damming. But it had some really pretty awesome off-channel habitat that we wanted to re-wet. And so again, we kind of looked at everything and used LiDAR and HEC2D to figure out where the berms were, the dozer berms, and then how high we were going to have to bring up the main stem to get those channels wet again. Pretty raw and ugly. This is right after we kind of cracked it open. This was part of the dozer berm through here. This is the side channel, obviously, going into the thing, and this is the main stem. Initially, this was a very high energy, high gradient stream, about 4% on average. This is what it looked like before, and then this is the same location after. So we're standing on one of the kind of the Pultel crest of the constructed riffle. Water's flowing this way, side channels coming over in here. You can see the emulated landslide deposit up here. Kind of, this is looking downstream. So this is our constructed riffle, and we actually put sinuosity in every one of these. So again, kind of the landslide things, and then the side channels actually kind of going off in here. And then this is kind of the example of the habitat, that the old historic habitat that came in, and really pretty spectacular. Did the same thing on the Zigzag River. And this is just showing, this is the old dozer berm right along here. And then we use this to identify areas where we're going to breach and also pop up part of the main stem channel. And again, this is kind of some of the habitat that was rewatered. So, you know, down cutting and stream bed deterioration are not always the big cause of floodplain disconnection. And that comes in some of these bigger rivers, highly disturbed, high sediment load systems. And this is kind of the squeeze it back up methodology. So here, this is the South Fork Skokomish River, and what happened here was they were going to build a dam just downstream of where this picture was taken. So of course they logged the entire reservoir perimeter, and then they got a geologist, and he figured that they were trying to build the dam on a fault line, so it never happened. So anyway, we had this was one of the first projects I almost thought there was nothing we could do, to be honest with you, but it was pretty cool. The Skokomish tribe and the Forest Service and the Mason County Conservation District wanted to go big, wanted to try it. So the design approach we had was, the only thing we could do is try to modify the cross-sectional area with pretty massive log jams. So we had over 60 log jams proposed in here to modify the existing cross-sectional area. And this is not on the Skokomish, but it's a good example of what we're talking about. So this is like our bar structure, also known as a bar buddy. And then this structure over here is bank and terrace structure, which we call FMFs. And you're modifying this cross-sectional area to do a couple of things. Number one, you scour a pool, but number two, you reactivate side channels throughout here. Oh, and I wanted to say something about these. These look pretty massive. Like, I think this is about 16 feet high, but we're building these above Q100. If you look at natural log jams, most of the wood is at or at least above Q100. And because when the river gets grouchy, they don't look quite so big. So here we are back on the South Fork Skokomish, and this again was kind of one of our bar buddy structures under construction. And this is after the first year. And I guess the thing I want to point out first of all is just look at the substrate change. It went from gravel to now mostly larger cobble. And so these top of the structure, oh, and by the way, there's another large FMF right over here on the outside of the picture. And so on this particular bar, we graded this, the bar height on just after the first year was almost 7 feet of aggradation on that bar. One thing I do want to talk about, the pinch it back up, is that when you build these log jams, they will accumulate wood. And there's no way to really estimate exactly how much. If Bruce Zolik is on our call right now, these are one of the ones one of the first ones he and I built on the Salmon River, this section here. And this is a couple years after, and I think, I don't have a recent picture, but this thing has gotten massive. So I guess the thing to be aware of is that they are going to grow. And if you are working in a FEMA floodplain, you need to really put some thought into what's going to happen.
Hey, Brian, this is Bruce.
Yeah, go ahead, Bruce.
Yeah, I was just going to add that jam, the surface area is 7 times bigger than when you built it.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. And here it is in action. Yeah. And that's the coolest thing is that, you know, when the wood comes in, it's like nobody even knows we were there. Really, it looks pretty natural. Oh, and since Bruce was just on the call, this is actually another Bruce and Brian project here. This was actually the funnest structure I think I've ever built in my life. And this is emulated landslide deposit, but this really was built like with the landslide. So there's a road up here and there was a slide, and we had a couple different objectives. But anyway, we decided to build this structure here, and we ended up building the wood frame and then bringing in dump trucks with rocks and boulders and dropping them down this chute. And this is the one I was gonna have a movie on because it's just really cool. But I think with our bandwidth and everything, it might have crashed it. But anyway, that was a really fun structure, a true emulated landslide deposit. All right, so with that, I'm going to talk about total channel reconstruction now. I'm going to use Resurrection Creek as an example. It was a project I did in 2005 and 6 with the Chugach National Forest. This was a mined system. It's on the Kenai Peninsula. This is before, this is right after, and then this is 14 years later in 2020. So again, we used basically developed our reference templates. Basically, you put those in an array, put them in AutoCAD. I have an awesome engineer, Corinne Marzullo, who I work with, who has worked with since 2006. Anyway, she'll cram these in here so it's different pools, glides, everything else into here. And then we go out with RTK and basically stake it and cut and fill, and then bring on the dozers and start moving earth. On this particular project, I think we moved a total of like 200,000 cubic meters or so. And then kind of filling in. So just to give you an example, so this is in our Meander 2 area. So the river is on the other side of the tailings piles. These are the tailings. I think they're about 20-something feet high over here. There's a little water in this cutoff channel, but it was just mostly groundwater seeping under the tailings. So this is what we call the rough out phase. So in this area, the river's still in the ditch that it was put in. But we're stockpiling all this other material that will go in to fill the old channel. This is after we've turned the water on and got that floodplain is now graded to the elevation that we want. This phase, now we're putting in the habitat features. So we've got our constructed riffles, we've got our log jam. This is a groundwater channel we dug, and then we've just turned on a side channel with a series of emulated beaver ponds in them. And then this is kind of the last but not least phase is the dirt. Super important to get your topsoil spread back on. I've actually seen some really pretty fantastic mine reclamation projects that were done. However, they didn't take the time and money to bring in soil. And I saw one that was 20 years old, and it was a beautiful job on the channel, but it was like a creek running through a moonscape, basically. So anyway, plug for the dirt. This is the first winter. Year after, 2 years after. What is this? 7 years after. And then this 10 years after, and then Viola, 14 years after. So anyway, what about the fish? It was pretty funny, right? I was at a conference in Montana years ago, and this guy gets up and he says, well, I have never seen any of you guys restoration projects that help one stinking fish. And I just so happened to be the talk presenting resurrection right after he said that. So what about the fish? So these are for Chinook live counts. This is within the project area. So in 2005, I think they had like 60 fish or less than 50 or something like that. 2006 was the first year that that was the first year fish could come in, actually spawn in it. And then we start seeing the bumps every year after that. It started crawling up and crawling up. And this is the last data I have is 2015. I need to get a hold of the Chugash and see where we are now. But I mean, we can't say that, you know, we increased the production or productivity there, but we can say that the fish really like it. And it doesn't seem like we screwed it up either. So it's pretty gratifying. Anyway, Palmer Creek was another tributary that came into res that we also rehabbed. Same thing there. And then the pinks really went absolutely berserk on it. I can't remember, there was only like a couple hundred. There was really not that any area for them to spawn within that project area. Some of those should have shown you more pictures, but anyway, it was basically a Cascade riffle ditch. And so, but man, look at this. We went from a couple hundred to over 30,000 within a handful of years. And the chum also, we dug a lot of groundwater channels, and those guys were just like high-fiving us with their fins. Okay, last thing I'm really going to talk about, and I just want to put a plug in for Mr. Paul Powers, who I originally hired as a fisheries tech like 27 years ago or so. But anyway, he is taken off, and he's also working for Enterprise right now and doing great things for both rivers and fish. And he and his cohorts have really gone in heavy with stage 0, which again is just doing some pretty remarkable things for floodplains and wetlands. The last thing I want to do is put in a plug for the Clackamas. I've been working with the BLM down off the North Umpqua River on Rock Creek restoration with a guy named Geoff McEnroe, who is a young up and coming, gonna be rock star of restoration here really soon. Well, anyway, I hope those guys design this floodplain restoration project, and we were gonna do 1.2 river miles this last year. And then the Archie Creek fire hit a lot, about actually the same time that all the Clackamas fires hit. And after we shook off the initial depression, we kind of dusted ourselves off and we're like, all right, let's go big. And so instead of 1.2 river miles, Geoff and crew were able to get over 5 river miles done, almost everything on BLM land. And the only good thing that really kind of came out of the fire was that we had an unlimited supply of fire-killed trees, and even including old growth. So huge boon for the project as far as reconnecting the floodplains and everything. And I think we have that opportunity in the upper Clackamas. And I'm going to be working with Bruce and Jack on the Clackamas River Ranger District up in Cub Creek this year, and then hopefully in subsequent projects on the main stem Clackamas in years to come. So I just want to kind of leave with this. Jack Ward Thomas, he was the chief of the Forest Service in 93 to 96. And he came in during the spotted owl era, and he was a wildlife biologist, and those were really wild times. But I was really fortunate to see him in Portland. He had a big Fish and Wildlife Forest Service bio conference. And one of the things that really stuck with me here, and I think is really, really true about my talk here, is that he said, of all people, scientists should be acutely aware that we know so little and that there is no final truth. To believe otherwise was just plain foolish. And I really do think that I'm fairly confident what we're doing is right, but you know, the river always wins. And so the rivers and the fish will ultimately tell us here in pretty short order if we are doing the right thing. So with that, questions?
Well, thank you very much, Brian. That was an awesome presentation. I really appreciate that you're able to integrate the time series of both data and photos from your project sites. That's pretty rare that folks in the restoration game have that kind of context to their projects. And I'm not calling you old, but
I call myself old all the time. Yeah, no,
but
I've had a fortunate career.
That was just incredible. I think that all of us in the Clackamas Basin are going to benefit tremendously from seeing your examples and get a little, just a snippet of your expertise here in the last 40 minutes.
I look forward to working with you guys. It's going to be great. I'm really glad Bruce Olick is, you know, head of the fish guys in Mount Hood, and we should do good.
Yeah, I once heard
Brian.
Oh, go ahead, Bill.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry, Brian. I did have a question. By the way, I'm glad you talk about Jack Ward Thomas. He was a friend, and he was the deacon of my brother's church in La Grande.
Oh, no kidding.
I
Wow.
drove with him up to Calgary when he delivered a speech to students at the University of Alberta as the spotted owl report was coming out. But like you said, one of the things that the Gang of Three came out with in Portland was the more we learn, the more we realize how little we know, and that certainly was true with his quote. But I was curious on where that substrate built up with all of those rocks behind the logs. Was that at all at the expense of any spawning gravel?
No, not necessarily. I mean, these were in areas, it's a large project area. It's about 1.5 miles, and we put in like 2,700 trees in there. So no, believe me, there's plenty of spawning gravel within that reach. So.
Okay, well, yeah, thank you very much. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, the thing, I think that the biggest thing there is that spawning was not occurring there very much because the width to depth, the low flow width to depth ratios in there were so extreme that, you know, the fish, there was like a couple inches of water kind of running over most of that area. So, but yeah. And actually, we're doing another phase. I was just working on the helicopter contract, so we're doing another 1.5 miles on the upstream of there this year.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Brian, real quickly, we also have another question here from that somebody typed in, and they were just, you kind of quickly jumped over to the stage zero concept real quick. Do you have, just in a nutshell, do you have a way that you would characterize stage zero to maybe the people who aren't as familiar with restoration practices?
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. So stage zero is really filling it back in, you know, filling it back to the historic floodplain level. And actually, it's really important to understand that that sounds simple, and it's not that simple, because you've got to think about starting other head cuts and things like that. But if you do want more details on that, please send me your contact information. I'll put you in contact with Paul Powers, who is the king of kind of stage zero.
Yeah,
But
and I
a
think
lot of
that,
times, I think a lot of times, for the most part, in my mind anyway, it's really good on like meadow restoration, less, not lower gradient areas that you're working in. He is doing it on the McKenzie and some other places too, but yeah.
and I believe there's even a YouTube on it too. So Maddie, if you're interested in just YouTubing, I think that they have a stage 0 project that they've kind of shown it before and after that might give you, but it's hard to characterize, but it's very much just filling in. It's a pretty aggressive technique for restoration, definitely.
It's very aggressive and very expensive.
Yeah. Yep. And like you're saying, maybe for wood-rich projects like the Clackamas, it might be a good approach, where we have a lot of wood sitting around right now.
All right. Well, with that, I think you'll have an opportunity to potentially ask another question if you think of one throughout our next presenter, and we'll have a chance to maybe answer that at the end of Geoff's session. So I'd like to introduce you all to Geoff Hales. Geoff is a licensed professional geologist. So we let a geologist in the room, so be careful. Specializing in fluvial geomorphology. His work emphasizes projects that focus on flow and sediment management needs to restore geomorphic processes on regulated rivers. Geoff has been working in the Clackamas River Basin since 2000 as a consultant to Portland General Electric, and develop and implement a wide range of geomorphic and habitat improvement programs and projects. So Geoff, go ahead and take it away.
All right, thank you. Okay, see if I can get my screen sharing privileges going. How are we looking?
Look great.
Excellent. Well, thanks for the intro, and Brian, that was a great presentation. Thank you. You know, I think what I'm going to do is dive into some Clackamas specific examples, really some applied restoration projects that we've been doing, projects and programs. We follow generally the same research, design, construction approaches that Brian had outlined. So this kind of tees off that pretty nicely. There's been a lot of work done in the Clackamas Basin from upslope to instream, helping to offset adverse impacts generated by historic land use practice. My work's focused on a partnership with PGE to help improve Clackamas River physical and biological function. And really the root of the change from natural conditions comes with alterations to flow and sediment supply. And dams do a pretty good job at doing both. PGE operates 5 dams in the Clackamas Basin under federal license. And as part of PGE's relicensing effort, we studied the segments of the river most impacted by project operations to develop programs for restoring the flow and sediment balance, with the objective of helping restoring natural processes and conditions that result in habitat improvement. We've implemented projects of all sizes and shapes. The majority of the work is focused on the Oak Grove Fork and the Mainstem Clackamas from North Fork River downstream to Eagle Creek. And I will get the presentation moving here with that. There we go. Okay, so as I mentioned, there's 5 hydroelectric dams operated by PGE under federal license, and it's a 45-year license that was issued in 2010. The previous license was issued in 1956. You can imagine that environmental regulations in 1956 were slightly less than they were coming into the relicensing in the 2000s. So as part of relicensing studies, this was when I was brought on in my firm, working with the Fish and Aquatics work group that eventually was it was an informative work group that went into a settlement work group for the license to help try to describe geomorphic changes that had happened on both the Mainstem Clackamas and the Oak Grove Fork attributed to facilities operations. And there's been several programs and projects developed to help offset these impacts by really working together with PGE under their new license requirements to help restore biological function and physical process. And those two are just intimately linked. The projects include all the way up in the basin, up on the Oak Grove Fork, working on side channel reconnection and habitat improvements. Those started to come online in 2012. That also has some we're doing some main channel habitat enhancements, including gravel augmentation and large wood habitat structures. That program started in 2014 and is continuing presently. Moving downriver onto the main stem up into the uppermost reservoir, which is North Fork Reservoir, we've done some largewood fish habitat creation and enhancement. That's been a pretty sizable project. That started in 2016 and continued in several phases through 2020. And moving even farther downstream through the lower river, down below River Mill Dam, we've got the Lower Clackamas River Coarse Sediment Management Program. And that came online in 2016. Each of these programs, there were several years and lots of people involved in identifying these as viable ways of getting the river to work better and the system to work healthier. So there's been a whole host of folks, you know, in the past that have helped pave the way to make these happen. And I've just had the distinct fortune of kind of being able to carry the torch and seeing them through implementation. So the CLAC, I'm sure for anybody that's attended most of these presentations in the series, you kind of just get a setting shot and an overview of where we are. So here's just an outline of the basin here. A couple of the major tributaries that are shown here for reference. The three yellow dots, I can move my cursor. These three that are down in the lowermost, kind of in the kind of upper left-hand corner of the screen here, I'll show the three lowermost facilities with River Mill Dam, there's Faraday Dib Dam, and then North Fork Dam at North Fork Reservoir. And then moving about another 30 miles upstream, we get to the Oak Grove Fork with Lake Harriet and Timothy Lake Dam. River Mill Dam is at River Mile 23 upstream from the Willamette River, and roughly about 72% of the drainage area lies above that. It was built in 1911, primarily to serve Portland's electricity demands. It's the downstream most of three dams, so it is the last one in line for generating sediment impacts to the river. There are hydro facilities here, so we're generating electricity, but we're not diverting flow. They're operated as run-of-the-river reservoirs. So what's flowing in is generally flowing out on the downstream side in magnitude and in frequency, but it has a very high trap efficiency, meaning all of the sediment that's being generated in the upper watershed is being trapped by the dams. So there really isn't a change in the flow regime, but there's a large disruption in sediment transport. A little bit farther upstream at the Oak Grove Fork, this looks like kind of the Riverside fire maps that everybody was glued to a couple of years ago. I didn't steal it from them. I actually generated this before that, but the Oak Grove, it's a smaller drainage, but a very important one, 142 square miles. And Lake Harriet Dam is down below Timothy Lake. I've got it highlighted here. And it is located 4.5 miles upstream of the Clackamas River confluence. There's a hydro facility there and a diversion. And what happens at Lake Harriet is flows diverted down a pipeline to the Three Links powerhouse, where it then returns to the Clackamas River. But that means the lower 4.5 miles below Lake Harriet Dam along the Oak Grove Fork have had significant flow reductions due to that flow diversion. So there's been an alteration to the flow regime. There's also a high sediment trapping efficiency in the reservoir. So on that one, we have both impacts to sediment and to flow. So operations that have been linked to issues from flow regulation and sediment supply, there's a host of physical things that have happened and have been very well documented by lots of researchers, both on the Oak Grove and the lower main stem. Main stem channel incision, side channel disconnection, reduced sediment storage. We've basically shut off the tap at the dam for sediment passing through. So what the river does is it recruits all of the available material that's left over downstream of the dam. So the number and the frequency and abundance of gravel bars, which are important habitat features, has gone down. The available grain size has also increased because all of the finer material has been winnowed away, leaving a coarse layer behind. In some cases, all of the sediment's been taken off and leaving just bedrock exposed and reducing bedload transport. So again, this really is messing with the flow and sediment balance that allows the river to form and maintain itself naturally. There are corresponding ecological changes that result from these geomorphic impacts. There's reduced salmonid habitat, there's increased water temperature. So again, maybe just taking on example of the side channel incision, we're disconnecting side channels that provide important year-round habitat for different life stages. And coarsening of the bar limits spawning area and it limits invertebrate production. And we have also increased water temperatures. So the disruption to the balance has caused a shift in the paradigm, and there's been some ecological response to that. So what do we do to try to help reverse these impacts? I'm going to give examples of 3 project types and programs that we've initiated and that a lot of them are still ongoing right now to help offset these impacts. The ones I'm going to highlight, I'm going to touch on sediment augmentation, side channel reconnection and habitat enhancement, and reservoir habitat creation. These are going to be kind of brief. Each one of these can be a seminar talk in and of themselves to talk about how we identified and formed the project and did all of the analytical and modeling to come up with what we've done. But I think this ties in nicely because it really shows Clackamas specific work that's happening, bringing a lot of the principles in that Brian had talked about, but really shows how we've applied them on the Clackamas and how successful they've been. So starting off with sediment augmentation, we're using the augmentation as a way to begin reversing the geomorphic impacts. Again, it's one of the major drivers in how the river forms and maintains itself. So if we can help restore that balance and make it work with the contemporary flow regime, then theoretically the river is going to be functioning more in its own harmony, which is going to allow biological response, meaning we're going to get more fish back because we're going to be improving those habitats that have been basically shut off for a period of time. So with coarse sediment trapping was behind the dams, it's resulting in downstream changes. The idea is just to resupply the river to begin reversing a lot of these effects by restoring a process. And then once it's kind of a, if you build it, they'll come philosophy. This photo here is one of my favorites. This is taken on the main stem Clackamas River, actually just downstream of River Mill Dam on the right bank. Looking at, it's the downstream end of where we're actually doing our gravel augmentation. And it shows a former gravel bar that it's a bedrock surface, but it was occupied formerly by a gravel bar. And we've seen this through historic aerial photographs. All of the material has been stripped off of that bar and transported downstream. There's nothing more that the river can recruit from this site. Over to the far right side where the flow energy is just a little bit less, there's a few boulders that are left over. Each of these boulders is close to 2 feet in diameter. So it's very large rock that's left over. The river just doesn't have the energy to transport it over its range of flows right now. So this is really everything that's left. The channel itself is incised, it's down cut over 2 feet in this particular location. And that was something that was measured by Dr. Peter Wampler when he was working on his dissertation through this area, did a wonderful study documenting a lot of the physical changes that occurred, the most sensitive areas below River Mill Dam, and what those impacts have been. So being able to tell a complete and cohesive story, all of the things that we take that we learn that happen downstream of a dam when you put a dam on a river are all pretty well shining examples of what happened here on the Clackamas of actually having a dam in for 100 years. So doing this both on the Oak Grove Fork and on the main stem Clackamas, it requires different augmentation strategies because we're working on 2 very different size systems that behave very differently. Although the problems are still the same, each of these are 2 very different channels. One's very high gradient, high up in the basin. The other one is low gradient down in the lower watershed. On the Oak Grove Fork, the natural basin sediment yield, so on average, what is the volume of material that comes down into that basin is 26 tons per square mile. And for anybody that does sediment budgeting, that's an extremely low number. It's in the high Cascades. It's very young and porous geologic material. It just doesn't generate a whole heck of a lot of material. It's actually a wonderful place to site a dam because there's hardly any sedimentation in that reservoir. The amount of material that we're putting back in on an annual basis on a unit average is about 4.6 tons per square mile. So it's only about 20% of what that average annual yield is. But there's a reason why we're not trying to do it at historic annual rates. You want to test it out and just try to make sure that it's actually working and working scaled to the flows that you have available. Our maximum annual volume that we're putting in on the Oak Grove Fork is 650 tons. Compared to what we're doing on the Clackamas River, 26,000 tons of material. And the average annual natural basin unit yield up there is an order of magnitude greater on the lower river. So again, two very different animals, 2 very different sizes on what we're doing, yet our concept is the same. And the reason why we're doing it is functionally the same thing, is trying to just get material in, but what's the most efficient way to do it and what's the best way to do it, and how do we make that happen? And what's an appropriate volume to do, and how do we answer those questions? The material is different that we're putting in. We're definitely catered a little bit more toward fish on the Oak Grove Fork. It's a prescribed distribution that meets habitat suitability criteria that are known for immediate fish use. Down lower on the lower Clackamas, we have so much more area that we're dealing with. We're dealing with unscreened, unwashed material, and the maximum size is up to almost 18 inches. It's very large material that we're putting back in the channel. So our placement methods vary. Sediment recruitment is varying as well. On the Oak Grove Fork, we have a steep and rugged terrain to try to get in, where we use a chute, and we build a tailless cone at the base of that chute with immediate recruitment. So that is the minute that sediment hits the water, it's in a high energy aquatic environment or hydraulic environment, and it immediately starts to flush downstream. On the Clackamas, it's more passive recruitment. The material gets loaded onto a high flow bedrock shelf and only starts to get recruited when the river gets up to a certain flow, which is above summer base flow levels. So we have to get to moderate winter flows before we even start to get that material entrained and moving downstream. Determining volumes and rates. There's in addition to doing computer-based modeling, we do a lot of direct measurements and physical studies. We can look at sedimentation rates into reservoirs, where we use bathymetry and bathymetric differencing to look at cut and fill volume areas and determine the volume that's been deposited over time. That gives you average rates and gives you an idea of kind of what the average basin yield is. We also do direct measurements, where we do bedload sampling off cataract-based platforms, and we're actually sampling bedload and linking that to certain flow thresholds, and being able to develop sedigraphs and sediment rating curves, so we can understand that how much material is actually moving given the flow regime that we have. So there's a lot of direct physical measurement and modeling that goes into coming up with appropriately scaling how much material we're going to be putting into the channel. Just to give you an idea of where we're doing this work, down below River Mill Dam. So my left photograph, the red box, is an aerial photograph. The red box highlights the bedrock area. That's that shelf that I was showing you in my previous photograph. And to the right, that's looking from River Mill Dam to that specific spot, with 20,000 yards of material placed ready for recruitment. This was done in late fall of 2018. And for size perspective, I don't know if you guys can see it on your screens or not, but right in the center of the photograph, there's bulldozers sitting right here. So that gives you an idea of just how tall this pile is. And what happens is once the river starts to get up and gets high, it starts to erode the toe of the slope, and the material naturally starts to ravel in and washes itself downstream. So rather than going to multiple places and multiple sites and placing material in, which arguably is a quicker way of distributing gravel downstream, that's generally a constraint that keeps you from being able to do this in many applications of gravel augmentation. You just don't have the ability to go into several different sites and move material, especially large volumes of material like that. And it almost becomes cost infeasible. So we're letting the river really do the work and sort it and route it downstream by itself. Here's some shots on the Oak Grove Fork. So much smaller scale of what we're talking about. At this particular site, this is immediately below Lake Harriet Dam in a slot canyon. It's called Crack in the Ground. And we're dumping 400 tons of material down this chute. And so we get a bunch of dump trucks that come up and they back up and literally just drop the load right into the chute, which slides on down the hill. It's an 80-foot chute at over 100% slope. It makes a hell of a racket when it goes down there, and it results in a large pile. But instantly, once it hits the water, because the hydraulic energy is so high, it's steep gradient and confined, it begins to immediately transport downstream. My top right photograph shows an as-built pile of 400 tons. And then coming back in January, just a couple of months later, the pile is totally gone and has moved itself downstream. A very efficient way of getting this done. We've got another spot farther downstream. This is only a mile upstream from the Clackamas confluence on the Oak Grove Fork in Ripplebrook Campground, where there's an eroding cut bank on an outside meander bend, which makes for a really great spot to put gravel in, because you're actually achieving two objectives. One is it's almost an instantaneous recruitment spot for the river. You're farther downstream. You're not reliant on waiting for the gravel all the way up at Crack in the Ground to get down here. But in addition, we're also preserving a bank in the campground that it keeps that campsite from raveling away. It's temporary, and the gravel is intended to move downstream, and it works pretty well being on that outside bend. And the material disperses downstream and starts forming gravel bars and has a really good biological response. So how do we chase it? How do we monitor it? We have objectives when we do this. We don't just chuck it in and hope it works and cross our fingers and walk away. We pay very close attention to how the material transports downstream. We want to absolutely make sure that it's not causing any problems or adverse impacts to property owners. On the lower river, there's a lot of homeowners that have encroached into the floodplain where, small changes geomorphically can result in big changes in somebody's yard. We want to be cautious of that. So we monitor things very carefully. On the Oak Grove, our monitoring strategies are, it's a less than a 1 mile reach that we're monitoring, and the average width of the channel is about 30 feet. You can pretty much walk down and observe where the gravel is depositing. We use a visual tracer. It's a unique rock that sticks out like a sore thumb in the water, so we can very easily tell where our material has been depositing. We do some photo points and photographic comparisons and looking at how alluvial features are building themselves. And we also use some ground-based photogrammetry, and we can do digital elevation modeling. It's a low-cost yet very high-resolution method to be able to detect gravel changes and attributed to our program. So there's lots of really neat ways of tracking it on the Oak Grove Fork that are very manageable at a one-person scale. You contrast that with working down on the lower mainstem Clackamas River, and especially when you get up into spring flows of several thousand CFS and looking for changes downstream, it becomes a little dicier. Most of the work that we're doing is boat-based or remote sensing-based. We're using a lot of aerial photography, photographic comparisons from photo points high up on terraces. We're going from what I've called on the Oak Grove Fork as grain scale with distance-based objective monitoring down to process objective monitoring down on the lower Clackamas River, where we're looking at changes in geomorphic form and geomorphic scale. So again, just to compare and contrast, we're trying to do the same type of thing with the same objective of really improving and restoring a process on a river by reintroducing sediment downstream of a dam that has blocked it. But the methods by which we get it into the river and the methods by which we can track it down the river are radically different. So our conclusions so far, and I say so far because again, this kind of touches back on what Brian was saying. We should be very cautious of what we're doing and never say we really know the final answer to this. What we're also doing right now is we're trying to reverse a process that has taken decades, many decades, to evolve into, and we're only a handful of years into our program. We're seeing encouraging results. Recruitment is successful at all sites where the river is taking the material, it is transporting it, it is routing it downstream. Our methods are scaled right. It allows us to see where the material is depositing and providing reliable data to evaluate our objectives. But the routing rates and distances are varying. We're reliant definitely on Mother Nature to see what size and duration of flow event are we going to get and how many each year are we going to get. Those are directly related to how much material is recruited and transported downstream. So it's something we need to kind of keep an eye on. We're heading in the right direction of meeting our program objectives, but we are still real early in the learning curve on here. One of the unique things, and I've presented this at a conference, that somebody asked me, why is this program so successful and why is it working so well here? Because lots of folks have had challenges with doing gravel augmentation projects. I say probably the biggest thing is our ability to actively monitor and manage our sites. Having project partners in the basin on site and able to make adjustments after every storm event, rather than just going in and looking at something maybe once annually or once every couple of years, really heightens our ability to adapt and to manage for this project. So key partnerships, agency key partnerships, PGE key partnerships, everybody has a vested interest in doing that. And that's what's been so great about doing Clackamas River work is everybody just really gung-ho about making this thing work out great. And so there's so many people that are keeping their eyes on this and helping us understand how it's working. So it's definitely a group effort. This is a great photo series. So this illustrates how the pile behaves. The photograph on the right shows that as-built sediment pile that I showed just previously with that 20,000 yards. The middle photograph is from the same photo point, but this is the day after near 30,000 CFS peak flow, which took over half the pile away. And the final photograph onto the right shows as flows have receded, not quite all the way to base flow, but at least to expose the majority of the shelf, what the aftermath looks like. So going back in and reloading that shelf to a 20,000 yard volume, we go back in and survey that. The as-built pile all the way on the left has a topographic survey that's done, And then the photograph all the way on the right, there's a repeat topographic survey that's done. And then we just determine the difference volumetrically to say, okay, well, it recruited 12,000 yards of material. So that's what we need to reload to go back to 20,000 yards. So we're managing, we're tracking how much the river is recruited, which comes, into some pretty good importance when we're looking downstream at where the material is depositing, how it's depositing, how much is being retained in our reach, and are we meeting those geomorphic objectives? And my last slide, I think, for at least the sediment augmentation component of my talk, really is kind of like the culminating experience. It's a pretty busy slide, but bear with me as I walk you through it. This is one of the slides that I'm most proud of. This shows 5 annual hydrographs starting from water year 2017 to water year 2021. That's what the blue line is. That basically looks like a cardiograph from, it's the heartbeat of the river. And we've got flow magnitudes that have ranged from 11,000 CFS in water year 2020 up to 30,000 CFS, 31,000 water year 2021. Now, by being able to go in and monitor after every peak event, usually the annual instantaneous peaks, the largest peak of the year, yet some of the middle ground peaks, has allowed us to put these horizontal lines on this chart. The bottom line here, which when we started the project, we knew 5,000 CFS is the separation between when the pile is wet and when the pile is dry. Anything above 5,000 CFS is when the pile starts to get wet. Once we get to 11,000 CFS, nothing happens to the pile. Even though the toe is getting wet, there's still not enough energy laterally to erode that pile. But what it does do is it mobilizes the in-channel deposits. So any material that's already in the channel that defines the stream bed is in motion. Once we get up to 17,000 CFS, that is when we start to initiate motion on the pile itself. So we have to hit 17,000 before we even start to get anything off of the pile. And then once we get up to 27,000, that's when it really starts to unzipper and you just get large volumes of substantial erosion from the pile. At that point, what you're really reliant on is additional magnitude and flow duration to maximize how much material is being recruited. And that's really the whole goal, is to recruit as much of that pile as we possibly can on an annual basis and get it back into the river. All right, I'm going to jump into, and what I think I'll do here, Tim, is we'll just kind of wait for questions on any of these 3 when I wrap it up, and we can go back to it because I just want to kind of power through these.
Sounds good.
Great. So of a totally different flavor now, side channel reconnection and habitat enhancement. So moving all the way back up into the Oak Grove Fork below Lake Harriet Dam, with the dam and diversion, reduced flows once the dam and diversion went online, they reduced the inundation frequency of all of the side channels, the distributary side channels that were between the dam and the confluence of the Clackamas River. In fact, we counted 27 side channels that historically flowed year-round and provided important 1+ coho rearing habitat. And with those side channels off, it really took a substantial portion of available habitat for that particular life stage away. And in order to get those side channels back on, one of the things that was happening is that in addition to adding sediment downstream, part of PGE's license obligation was to put more flows downriver. And there had been a very detailed, focused, and multi-partner study involved in looking at habitat studies and what is an appropriate flow regime to allow downstream or to create downstream based on water year type that really optimizes and supports each of those species and life stages, from steelhead, from coho to chinook. The side channel component of that, recognizing that that was really important for natal rearing, was to be able to get those side channels turned on once we started to put more water downstream. Well, each of those side channels sat at a slightly different elevation. So what we needed to do was figure out which ones we wanted to target, which ones provided the best and well-spaced distribution downstream that could provide at least 40,000 square feet of coho habitat, which was a number determined by the habitat studies as something that should be restored back in the channel. So there was a biological target that was set. We now had the task of a physical job to go out and do and solve that to get that 40,000 square feet of habitat back in the side channels. So identifying each of the side channels, we had to do a series of surveys over a range of flows to develop entrance flow relationships. And the trick here was that each side channel sat at a different elevation. It was a very short gap that we had to bridge from what the new water surface elevation would be to having it flowing continuously year round. Others, it was going to be a very large jump of several feet to get that side channel cleared out and to be able to flow at the target elevation that we wanted it to flow at. So for each of those, it took some time over a particular winter to be out during a range of flows and develop rating curves. And this is what this chart here shows, is a rating curve that's fit, that has water surface elevations that were surveyed. The red vertical line represents what the side channel control elevation is, meaning that's the threshold that flows needed to get over before you would have continuous flow downstream. And that's what they were flowing at. So this particular side channel, it didn't crest its entrance flow threshold until 300 CFS. But our target was to get it to flow at least a half foot deep at 80 CFS. So that represented a substantial lowering, but this was the method for us to say just how much we had to do it. There's one way you could do it, is just wait until the flows are up and go out and start digging things out, but that's not really efficient. And we have to be a little bit more calculated than that, especially for being efficient with our time and resources. What we were able to do for each of those, once we identified and got those flow thresholds identified, we kind of went through the same design steps and iteration process of doing the evaluation and trying to figure out geometrically and hydraulically what needed to be excavated in order to make it work. So a lot of topographic surveying and then design development that we could then give a set of plans to our contractor and say, this is how we need to cut it out. And it gave us some very specific details on what to do for each of those side channels. In addition, we were able to talk about, standard engineering things like cut fill volumes, entrance hydraulics, side slopes, and things like that for developing the plans, as well as trying to figure out logistics, feasibility, access, and then additional habitat enhancements that we wanted to do on those side channels by bringing in large wood. It's a pretty remote area, so we needed to have a very focused plan going in to be able to be efficient with our time. Here's a shot that shows on the left-hand side one of these side channels that was identified as a historic side channel. It's kind of hard to see, but I'm moving my cursor in and along the path of where flow is. And this is something that wouldn't have been shut off permanently, but it only would have flowed during high flow events. But the goal was, again, to get this flowing for year-round, to provide year-round habitat. And the right-hand photograph then shows a newly constructed as-built photo of what it looks like now flowing at that target flow condition. So very precise surveys to be able to know what elevation things needed to be cut to. That way we could go in and know exactly where and how deep we needed to make those cuts. And once water was the new flow regime came and water was coming down the side channel, we were able to go back and see the fact that, yes, indeed, these are flowing and doing what they're supposed to be doing. This particular side channel here is one of the longest ones that we created, is over 1,000 feet long. And it was opened up in July 2014 and is still flowing today. So, and it has a whole lot of young coho in it. So it's rewarding to be able to see that, you can go in, you can cut these things open, but seeing the biological response is that's the rewarding part about it. This is the side, this is just a little bit farther downstream with some logs that were placed in to increase our habitat potential. Another shot we have here. And then kind of summing it up, once the physical work was done, the biological monitoring came in to essentially show what it has shown through almost immediately in the first couple of years of monitoring. Maybe the first year of monitoring was showing rapid and substantial response to the flow adjustments in the habitat work. And remember, we did a couple of major things on the Oak Grove Fork. We increased base flows substantially. We opened up the side channels, and we're doing some gravel augmentation. So sort of the combination of all of these things has resulted in positive changes in fish size, in production, in life history, in increase in species richness. Once the new flow regime started, Chinook showed up in the Oak Grove Fork for the first time in over 90 years. And that was something that we didn't expect to see. All right, now I'm going to move on to reservoir habitat creation. So North Fork Reservoir, so moving back downstream from the Oak Grove Fork down to North Fork Reservoir. So we're at pretty much the last stop of the Clackamas River before it hits the hydro complex, moving downstream through North Fork Reservoir and from past North Fork Dam to Rivermill Dam. And what I'm showing, this is North Fork Reservoir here on the left-hand photograph. The red box illustrates the project reach, which is the transitional reach of the reservoir. This is where the river, where really the Clackamas River becomes the reservoir. You can see really quickly here on the left-hand side, the downstream right-hand portion of my photograph, all of these little dots here represent habitat work that was done. We then did a lot of structures over on the left-hand side, hugging the left-hand bank, opened up a side channel and an alcove back in this area and created more habitat structures here. Anybody that's driven up Highway 224 past Promontory has probably seen a lot of these and maybe scratched your head wondering why we built so many docks for kayaks. The transitional reach, though, something that we have learned, and this was something that was in the eyes of the Forest Service for quite a long time, is that this particular reach of the river has very high fish use. Fish are very attracted to it. It has high use, but it has very little habitat. It's an important reach. The hydraulic transition, you're really dropping out in velocity and you're depositing sediment at the upstream end of the reservoir. Anadromous fish are going to use this zone for the juvenile migrants as well. So the out migrants as well as adult spawning coming up. But all of the habitat in this area, the river all of a sudden gets very wide as it enters into the mouth of the reservoir. The only habitat you have is limited near shore, where you basically have limited cover habitat from alders and a couple of cedars that are growing along the banks. Once you get out into the main channel, there's literally nothing there. And it's a homogeneous surface. It's a very uniform channel. It's a plain bed channel that has no complexity to it. And there's really no diversity. And most of the substrate is extremely uniform. So it's kind of a habitat desert. Although it has a lot of potential, hydraulic, geomorphic, food delivery, water quality conditions, they can create, very favorable settings, provided that we have some habitat for the fish to be able to essentially congregate around. In the Clackamas, particularly, all natural anadromous fish production moves through this zone of the reservoir. So anything that we do is helping out the natural fish run. So our goals for North Fork Reservoir were to design and construct habitat structures, large wood structures specifically, that can withstand the hydraulics of the high flows while emulating a natural aggregation of woody material and create cover and habitat create complex habitat. It's a fancy way of saying we wanted to create a bunch of log jams out there, knowing that there is a reasonably high wood loading into the reservoir during high water years, and that we're, one of the design evaluations in our understanding was that wood loading can be high, and whatever we build, we can expect to grow. It can rack up and aggregate additional wood. So keeping that in mind, that was part of our design philosophy, was knowing that more wood is going to rack in and these structures are going to grow and get bigger. So with the goal of down in the lower part of the reservoir, we did this over a two-phase project within 3 years, mostly through Clackamas Mitigation Fund dollars. And in the lower part of the reservoir, we were focusing more on juvenile rearing and cover habitat. And a little bit farther upstream, at the upstream end of the project, we're transitioning more into the riverine reach, where the idea was to promote adult cover and spawning habitat. That reach had been touched lightly by the Forest Service in, I believe, 2014, with limited log placement on the banks, and the response was phenomenal. The amount of fish per log that showed up, that really keyed everybody into seeing that section of what if so many fish are showing up with such little change that they're really hungry for something, or can really use velocity breaks and really need that cover habitat in order to maximize use in this particular area. So it was ripe for doing this work in. Going back through kind of the steps that Brian had talked about, our design approach was, obviously developing what our design criteria were. What did we want to do? How do we want these to function? We have to collect our information that's going to allow us to do our evaluations geomorphically, hydraulically, hydrodynamically with our modeling, force balance calculations, looking at the wood structures and the hydraulics acting on them. We certainly want to make sure that these are going to be lasting and staying over time. There's some very specific aesthetics that we want to meet. We don't want to, and there's a lot of regulatory constraints as well on ways that we can and can't construct these. And so we have to make sure that we can evaluate a structure that takes all of these design criteria into consideration. And then we develop our designs as well as doing a risk analysis and running it through a whole series of hydraulic scenarios to make sure that we're at least headed in the right direction. What is the saying that, all models are wrong, some are useful, but it gives us a really good understanding of where things are going. And really the development of RAS2D and some of the other hydrodynamic models over the years has come, it's almost like every year modeling has leaping forward so much in its advances that I'm beginning to trust it more and more. I still don't trust it fully, but I trust it more and more. Part of the geomorphic evaluations we do, we look at channel migration, channel meander, channel stability over time through a series. An example here is looking over a series of air photos dating back to the 1940s all the way up to just pre-project we have, but looking at times where the river would have responded to major geomorphic events. In 1946, this is what the river looked like naturally out of the influence of any reservoir, because North Fork Reservoir wasn't finished until 1958. Then we've got a photograph showing 1967, which would have been just a couple years after the 64 flood. Then in 2000 would have been just a couple years after the 96 flood. So between the 64 and the 96 event, those are the two largest events we have on record in the basin. And then looking at 2018. So this gives us some insight into how the river is either dynamic or reasonably stable, and it allows us to design according to how it's behaving in those areas. For how we implemented the project, we brought in all of the materials into the reservoir and staged them. We actually rafted the logs and soaked them in the reservoir for a number of months to help reduce buoyancy. PGE was able to draw the reservoir down to allow us to have ground-based equipment and machinery. Originally, we didn't know that this was going to happen. This was something that we had designed the project to all be constructed based on barges, but we got really lucky that we were, through a fortunate sequence of events, we were able to find out that the reservoir could be drawn down at our project site, exposing almost all of the area that we needed to allow a ground-based approach and ground-based equipment crossing over to the other side of the river, which allowed us to complete our project, at least this initial phase of the project, within half the budget and half the time. That allowed us to go back in, spend additional dollars that were remaining from that grant, and continue to do additional work upstream. So we really got 2 years for one with the ability to draw the reservoir down and really expand our project footprint. Work was done with excavators, pretty typical for doing these large wood installations: dig pits, arrange logs, place your smaller material, and backfill. What you can't see in this photograph here with the arrangement of these logs is that there's an entire second course of logs that are lying below this one. And you just, like Brian said, the river always wins. We needed to have in a couple of key places that the modeling told us, we were calling these the Chicago Bears defense particular log jams. They're extremely well fortified and arguably overbuilt, but it's something that we feel, you really have to be risk averse, and you want to be assured that how you're doing this work, especially given some of the constraints on how to do the construction, that you're gonna, have a stable feature. And we were able to drive the piles in with a vibratory pile driver, fairly common for doing this. Here's a photo showing the logs being rafted across the reservoir. That's the photograph on the right. And this is several hundred logs that are being pushed across, and a little bit of a closer up photo sorry, that was on the left. On the right-hand photo is a little bit closer up of the logs that are in. And each of these stayed cabled and rafted up until it was time to take individual logs and use them, stage them at their site, and use them in the construction. Here's a construction sequence. I won't worry too much about the narrative, but going clockwise from the upper left and following from A to B to C to D, just shows the construction sequence for how each of these features are built, with a pit being dug, which would be step A, and then the logs being laid into that pit at the design specifications. And so by doing force balance calculations, the hydraulic force and the buoyancy force acting on the logs, we need to make sure that they have an inclination and a declination relative to how the river is flowing in order to make sure that they're meeting those design criteria. So that's what some of the oversight does, is to make sure that they're meeting those criteria. Once those are done, the remaining logs get stacked in that I'm showing in photograph C. And then all the way on the bottom left for photograph D is getting the piles in using the pile driver. And what's noteworthy about this with the pile driver, each of those piles are 20 feet long, and they got driven into anywhere from 8 to 16 feet embedment. 8 was the minimum depth that we wanted. but some of these were allowing us to get them 16 feet deep, which far exceeded design specifications, but and we had really nice site conditions that allowed us to do that, but that gave us additional confidence in the stability of the features. And here's a finished shot, and this just kind of demonstrates how we do some of the monitoring. And this is just a photographic sequence showing all four sides being both parallel to flow and perpendicular to flow, facing toward the left and right bank and upstream and downstream. But these are as-built. Then we can go in and reoccupy these same locations over time and look at additional wood that's racked up, or how we've got scour holes that are developing on the front side, sediment depositing on the back side. And summing it all up, with all of this work that was done, it was done and completed over a 1 mile reach, well, almost a mile reach of the river, basically 5,200 feet of channel through the upper transitional zone of North Fork Reservoir. We built 48 habitat structures, 790 logs were used, plus or minus, and we had immediate fish use. As soon as the logs were in, PGE and partners were doing dives, looking to see what might show up. The bottom right photograph shows a bunch of juveniles that are congregated around the reservoir structures farther down in North Fork Reservoir. And the upper photograph, and you can kind of see in the far part of your screen that I'm circling, are adults that are getting into the upper transitional reach structures. And they moved right in as soon as we built them. And it was pretty amazing. And the expectations and the hunches that we had were really kind of coming true. And it's pretty rewarding to see that happen right off the bat. The geomorphic objectives as well. I mentioned earlier that this was basically a monotonic desert of a reach. And so not only, so the structures themselves are providing perturbations in flow and velocity, which then are going to have effects on sediment sorting and other material being racked up. So new material comes in and aggregates on the structure, changes the velocity dynamic, creates a scour hole on the front side, and causes some deposition on the backside. And what it's really doing is causing good sediment sorting. We're getting a really good heterogeny of sediment where we have fine sediments depositing on the backside. Willows are growing in the structures. They're evolving quite nicely. So all of the goals and hopes that we had for these structures they're really coming true, basically informed by a lot of the data collection, the hydro evaluations, the geomorph evaluations that we did, put us pretty much spot on with how it was going to behave. So that gives us good confidence in a project like this and being able to apply it, farther on down the road in another area. This is kind of the crown jewel of the upper reach here. These are the uppermost log structures that we finished in 2020. The 2019 upper photograph shows a red mapping that was done, and this was prior to our building the structures. But it still is where the fish were congregating around the structures that the Forest Service had built in some of the bank logs that they had put in 2014. And the blue polygons show the locations of the reds that were mapped, and there were 38 reds mapped in 2019. The bottom photograph shows our post-project after the structures were built. So now you can see where they're located relative to the top photograph. But what's really impressive about that are the red polygons, which show reds that were mapped in 2020. That was the year of construction, literally just a couple months after we built the structures. And then again in 2021, where it increased from 2019, where there were 38, to 20 and 21, where there were 133 and 149 respectively. And kind of like Brian said, you can't attribute everything that when the fish show up, you can't attribute it's all because of what you did. Maybe we're getting into a higher run return year, maybe not, but through a combination of things that we're doing and monitoring the reach previously, we sure feel darn good about what's happening out there, and the continued monitoring is showing continued use. And so we're pretty confident that the changes that we've done and what we've provided are working really well in supporting these populations. So to summarize, the recognized changes and associated impacts that the river in the basin overall are being addressed through coordinated data collection, design, analytical, and implementation projects. I'm just touching on a few that I've been lucky enough to be in charge of and responsible for. But the efforts to help restore processes have shown really good success, in part to robust monitoring, being able to manage them adaptively. We're still learning about them. But what's also really cool about the whole Clackamas Basin is that we're seeing cumulative effects, and not only the work that I'm doing and partnering with PGE on, but work by everybody else. restoration efforts by other folks and the tributaries, the side channel projects, Parsons, McIver, Kingfisher, Clackamas River Basin Council Shade Our Streams programs, North Fork Habitat, North Fork Clackamas Habitat improvements. And this is just reaching on a couple of them to try to cover my bases spatially on what's happening in the basin, all doing phenomenal work. And it's all really promoting river recovery and sustainability. And that's what's really exciting about what we're seeing in the Clackamas Basin. So just to wrap my stuff up to close, there's a few folks I need to acknowledge on this. It's PGE, all of the departments and groups that are contributing to the data collection, to developing and overseeing the programs, all of the supporting, partnering, and federal and state agencies that have worked through this, that have really supported all of these efforts and have taken a really vested interest in it. Oregon Wildlife Foundation, Clackamas River Basin Council, their partnerships on the projects that I've been in charge of. And last, certainly not least, Aquatic Contracting, who has had a hand in every construction project that I've been in charge of, and probably every other one that I named off of as well. They really deserve a heck of a lot of credit. And they're unsung heroes for the artistry that they do with the work on the river. And I'll end with that.
Geoff, are you ready for questions?
I am.
John Borden, I'm interested in how you monitor where the gravel placed in the stream ends up. And I guess particularly, what is the rock that you use that's the tracer? Is it something I would be able to see and recognize?
It is. So we're using the tracer up on the Oak Grove Fork, where that represents 5% of the volume that we're adding when we add it in. So it's a argillite. It actually comes from Montana. It's a metamorphic mudstone, but it's called rainbow rock. It's a decorative landscaping rock that when it's wet, it's anywhere that comes in colors from red to yellow to blue to green. So lithologically, it's unique to the basin. It just doesn't occur naturally anywhere in the Clackamas Basin. And it shows up quite nicely. So if you're walking down, you'd have to walk down the Oak Grove Fork to look at it. Probably the best odds of you seeing it are anywhere from Ripple Brook to Rainbow Campground. Look at the gravel bars there, and that's where you're going to find it.
Thank you. I think I recognize rainbow rock.
I got to say, it's the first time I've ever heard our project characterized as a monotonic desert, Geoff.
I've heard you use habitat desert before.
Yeah, I frequently use that.
Well, I was inspired by Dave's biogeomorphic term, so I had to counter with something.
Hey, Geoff,
Geoff?
great presentation. I did appreciate one comment you made about the models, and I, like you, I really was always nervous on the modeling end of things and trusted more of the stuff that I surveyed myself. But you're right. HEC 2D is just like mind-blowing right now. We had a side channel on the Salmon River that we wanted to get wet at 600 CFS, and by God, it's getting wet at 600 CFS. So I don't know if we were lucky or if that model's just really good, but I agree with you on that. And I guess to kind of tag along with the comment on there, LiDAR lie.
Yeah, right.
LiDAR has cost me a lot of money and time.
You know what I've really appreciated some of the modelers that I work with, and I'm sure yours do the same thing, is doing the calibration and validation modeling. So, you know, I feel a lot better when I can come back after measuring flow, after coming back with surveyed water surface elevations and giving it to them, and they can run model iterations to adjust to those, and rather than just spit out something that may or may be plus or minus 3 feet within what I'm looking at. So it's really the ability of the models to do that simply it's increased my confidence.
Yeah, and it's true. I mean, it's garbage in is garbage out, you know, and so, but yeah, I really appreciate that comment.
I appreciate both you guys. That was a heck of a presentation. Bill, do you have a question?
Yeah, just a quick one, Geoff, and it's more functional than scientific. The structures in the upper North Fork reservoir that you put in to where the river widens, do they attract any interest from the stock trout in the reservoir?
I'm going to actually punt to Garth as the lead biologist on that one. I think some of the, just any cover habitat is going to be good for fish, but Garth's the one that's been in charge of diving those. So, Mr. Wyatt, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I haven't seen any in there, Bill. I would fall short of saying that they don't use them. I assume that they probably would. I mean, the mergansers certainly do for a good reason. There's a lot of juvenile coho caged up around each structure. So it would not shock me if there was some hatchery planter trout in there. But once you start moving towards the upper end where you get velocity, those stalkers usually stay down in the inundation zone where the velocities are really low. So
Yeah,
I've not seen them, but I kind of build off what Brian said, the LiDAR lie, the fish certainly don't. And so it was great to see fish occupancy in both of these examples in Jeff's presentation and Brian's presentation, because ultimately they'll tell you if you did it right. And to see that occupancy in both sets of talks occur right after the projects were constructed is a sign that you did something right. So we just got to make sure they persist through time, or at least evolve through time and provide that benefit. But I think both presentations give us a lot of hope in the Clackamas Basin with the funding that we've got, that we can really do some good things and achieve that biological uplift that we're charged with putting forward. So
yeah, and it's good to know too that there's probably not a lot of competition up there between the hatchery and the wild fish.
yeah, well,
Yeah.
the coho are spawning on top of the Chinook now, so we're gonna have a little interspecific competition, but it's just good. It's all natural production. So I think at the state where the Clackamas is at, we'll take any natural production we can get at this point. So it's great to see.
Yeah, thanks.
One point that Brian had made a while back when he was asked about, spawning habitat and how it changed in relationship to his structures. One of the things that I think that we noticed, it's really intangible on how to develop in the relationships with these habitat structures. And that's how fish really seek cover. Fish want to seek those niches. And it seems like the structures really are a real magnet for, all types of, adults holding in there, juveniles in there. And the one of the reasons why we started when Tom Horning was looking at those sites to start placing those initial habitat structures was that we noticed that there was always fish spawning around a stick sticking up in the middle of the reservoir, in the monotonic desert, Jeff. But there would be a branch hanging out, a stick out there, and that's where the fish would always choose to cover. And that's kind of where we got the idea that, that we can really build on this habitat if we start adding the hominess feeling, to this desert.
Yeah. And I'm really glad and excited to see Brian getting into the basin here and working with Bruce and unleashing him up in the upper basin, because Lord knows we can use some improvement up in that area. So it's going to be pretty neat. We're starting to get some appreciable numbers of fish back to utilize that habitat that they're going to build. And I don't know, the future's bright. We got a pretty unique story here, kind of similar to the Sandy River Basin. So it's neat that we're just right here within the metro area and there's so many eyes on it. So going to be cool.
Yep.
Well, I don't think we have any other questions unless I'm mistaken. Thank you all for tuning in, and we'll catch you at the next session.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity, guys.
Yeah, thank you very much,
Yeah.
Brian and Jeff. That was
Appreciate it.
truly appreciated.
Yeah, thank you much.
Thanks,
Great rest of your
Brian,
week.
Jeff. Yeah, great job, you two. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
Thanks. See you guys.
Have a good day, everyone. Bye.